welcome to Niaga Spotlight with me, Tamina Kausji. Niaga Spotlight goes through the week in business and future affairs, market watch, industries, analysis and insights. We've got you covered right here on Niaga Spotlight. Well, now this week on Future Affairs, we're looking at the timely topic of reforming Felda. Now, Felda is currently, of course, facing dire financial strains, recording 1 billion ringgit in losses in 2022, nearly double the 545 million ringgit in losses recorded just the year before, according to the recently released Auditor-General's AG's 2022 report. So Felda has been advised to chart a clear direction towards operating without further financial assistance from Putrajaya, having received 200 million ringgit in grants in 2022, 342 million ringgit in grants in 2021. Niaga Spotlight today looks at viable strategies for reforming Felda and ensuring independent operation, hopefully in the near future. Dr. Edmund Terence Gomez, Chairperson, C4 Center and former Professor of Political Economy, joins me in the studios now for this discussion. Prof, how are you doing today?
I'm fine.
Thank you so much for making time.
Thank you.
All right. So let's get started off by setting the scene and perhaps spending a little bit of time, Prof. Edmund, in really looking at what these recent figures, facts and figures from the AG's report for 2022 are heartbreaking for Felda.
Yeah. So let's put this in context where this discussion begins. The root of it is the the Auditor-General's report,
That's
2022. Right. Now here, when you look at this, Felda is a key institution that he mentioned, but I'd like to add that the other institutions were also mentioned, including LTAT, MARA, and we have to discuss those institutions too. This is because Felda can be presented as a case study of the larger issue of GLCs in general, which are in crisis, if I may say that.
Fair enough. Now, also Felda, of course, was incorporated as a statutory body all the way back in 1956. So that's almost close to 6 decades. And coming back now to the fact that it is the nature of the incorporation, right?
Yeah. The important point you're making here is that Felda is a statutory body. When Felda was created, it was created by law. That's what it means when you say it's a statutory body. Felda was also created to help the landless poor. You said in 1956 it was incorporated. At that time, more than 50% of the rural poor were mired in poverty. And if you look at its early history, Felda was then listed as a success story. It took about 1 million people out of poverty. It made the landless poor a landed gentry.
Correct.
These are important developments. They took the poor and made them a middle class with a steady income, with land, with access to social mobility. Now, what we have to discuss is what went wrong.
Fair enough.
If we were there at this point where we had a great6 story, why is it these same people today are mired in debt? You will remember that the government had to give about 8 billion ringgit to bail out the loans by these very settlers who had emerged as a vibrant rural middle class.
Correct. And this was only something that was seen as a historical narrative only 2013 onwards, though. Pretty recent, right? Roughly about a decade exactly ago.
Actually, that's not entirely correct. The turning point was 1991.
All right. What happened in 1991?
In fact, sorry, let me get that right. It's 2001. The turning point was really 1999. Now, here's the thing. If we want to understand what's happening within these GLCs, including Felda, we must understand Malaysian politics. In 1999, we had this feud between then Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad and Anwar Ibrahim. And from there emerged the Reformasi. And in the 1999 election, the Barisan Nasional under Mahathir did very badly. They lost significant amount of rural Malay support. In 2001, Mahathir did a fundamental shift. For institutions like Felda, which are situated in rural areas, the chairman of Felda was now a politician. A chap named Yusuf Noor was appointed as the chairman. That was a fundamental shift because before that, the chairman was always from the civil service.
That's right, correct.
And now you're seeing a shift in terms of managerial control from civil servants to politicians. So the turning point really was 2001. And when politicians then took over, Mahathir also had another vision. He wanted to corporatize these government agencies, these statutory bodies. He preferred to also privatize them. He wanted to publicly list these companies. That's a major institutional change. And so you see the emergence now of holding companies like FGV, Felda Global Ventures, which was subsequently publicly listed. Now that's a major institutional change, which meant that here now, settlers until 2001 had a big say in the running of Felda.
The day-to-day, yeah.
That's right. It's their land. They had a voice. It was important that their voice needed to be heard. There was a shift here now. By creating Felda, in the sense that the chairman was now a politician, creating FGV and situating a lot of assets there, and then FGV had subsidiaries. Now, if you will see a trend, the Prime Minister controls the chairman of Felda, and the chairman of Felda so happens to be the chairman of FGV, who so happens to be the chairman of the subsidiaries, in this case FIC, which had investments abroad. This monumental shift in the politicization of Felda through control of this institution, business control, is where we must look to for the starting point for the crisis that Felda is now in.
Exactly. So it's also interesting that in the quest for corporatization, though, what ultimately resulted was weak management. Can we speak to that a little bit?
Now, the issue of weak management, again, needs to be probed further. If they had brought in professionals and let the professionals run it, if they had brought in people from the Felda community who were key players in that sector and made them part of the management.
And they had not just grassroots knowledge, but land acquisition.
And they became part of the management.
Fair.
They were part of the board of directors. That's the first point. How many people from Felda were part of the board of directors of Felda, or subsidiaries like FGV and FIC? That's the first issue we need to look at. In that sense, did they have a say? The second issue here really is that when we look at what was Felda set up for? They were in the plantation sector. But when they set up FGV, suddenly we see diversification. They were going into areas that was not part of what Felda was supposed to do, which is to be in plantations, it's supposed to be in palm oil, go upstream, downstream, invest in R&D, bring in new technology, increase production.
Build the ecosystem.
That's
per
right.
se, right? Yeah.
Develop it, use the financial resources you get from corporatization, from the public listing, which they got a lot of money from the public listing, invest it back into Felda's operations, and upgrade the whole system. But that's not what they did. And that's also because the board of directors did not constitute people who were also sufficiently enough from among the Felda settlers. What this meant was the Felda settlers' voice was now gone in terms of managerial control, in terms of what FGV was doing, in what other subsidiaries like FIC was doing. This is where the changes occurred, which then undermined Felda as an institution as a whole.
Fair enough. Now, so those are some of the structural issues that we're looking at fundamentally. At the same time, though, in the recent statement by the Prime Minister, Dr. Sri Anwar Ibrahim, there was also insight put on to LTAT, for example,
Yes.
in the same breath as Felda was mentioned. Why would it be also good to look at the way in which such GLC structures are run?
LTAT is a different type of institution. It's what we call a pension fund. Felda is a statutory body which was created to empower the poor. LTAT was a pension fund for people in the armed forces, the retired armed forces staff. It was supposed to be functioning as an investment body. As a pension fund, you take the money in the pension fund and you invest it in institutions like EPF, like PNB.
Sure.
But that's not what LTAT did. LTAT became a business group. By that I mean they bought Boston, they bought Farmer Niaga, they bought Affin Bank, and they were functioning like a major conglomerate. That's not the role of LTAT. LTAT was supposed to be like Co-op or EPF or PNB, where they have these funds, they just have an equity interest, they get dividends, and these dividends are then channeled back. But when LTAT went into business, then you can see here now, Boston, for example, mired in all kinds of controversies. LTAT was mired in a lot of defense controversies. We can speak of the LCS scandal. We can speak of the OPV scandal. We can speak of the Scorpion scandal. There's so many scandals attached to LTAT Boston. Pharma Niaga had its own range of problems in the health industry during the COVID crisis. This came out. So here we see a different kind of institutional structure. I'm glad you brought up LTAT. We have two different types of institutions, both classified broadly as GLCs, but both function very differently. And in terms of managerial control, who has them? In the case of LTAT, it was not a politician, you know. It was a professional businessman who was closely aligned to then Prime Minister Najib Razak, who had control at LTAT and Boston and the subsidiaries below. So you can see here the different mechanisms through which the Prime Minister in particular can appoint certain people to be chairman of key institutions within a particular institution and its subsidiaries, and then control the whole line, right down to level 3, level 4 of subsidiaries. And the real corruption is in the case of LTAT, where we see them occurring, is at the level of subsidiaries, away from the public eye, until the scandal gets exposed. And then we have a big problem. So today, LTAT, Boston, they're in bad shape. Felda is in bad shape. The auditor-general did a great job by exposing all this. But this is only the tip of the iceberg.
So speaking about tips of icebergs as well, Prof, let's now go into, Prof. Terence, looking at the fact for some major factors that could have actually contributed to the significant downturn in Felda's profitability, where we're comparing basically 545 million ringgit in losses in just 2021, but then it's going up to $1 billion in 2022.
Yeah.
Of course, there was the pandemic. We had a global lockdown. We also had supply chain disruptions. But could that in itself have led to a 50%, close to doubling of the entire losses?
That is only part of the story. The other part of the story that still needs to be told, and I'd like to get into this, is the investments abroad. I'd like to talk about FIC, the Felda Investment Corporation. The investments in London. They acquired property in London. They acquired a hostel in London, hotels in London. And there were serious problems with overpricing of this property. There were serious allegations of corruption. Let me also say this. Involved in these deals were companies from the British Virgin Islands. This brings up issues raised in the Panama Papers and the Pandora Papers. We are actually now getting into an area which is really covert. These issues now have come to the fore and they haunt Felda. Did the Felda settlers know of all these investments transpiring abroad? Were these investments necessary? Definitely not. Should Felda have gone there? FIC, FGV, should they have gone there? No, they should not have gone there. That's one set of problems. The second set of problems, the FGV, which was publicly listed. FGV then went and bought a company called Eagle High, which was linked to Peter Sonka, the Rajawali Group, who was reputedly very closely linked to Najib Razak. And that turned out to be a disastrous acquisition. Who agreed or who pushed through this acquisition? This is what happens when you take out decision-making control from the settlers and put it in the hands of an elite. And look at the decision-making processes involving these elites and where they have invested Felda funds. This is a serious abuse of power that we are seeing here. These are the issues that the Prime Minister, Anwar Ibrahim, must address, because these are the issues he said he wants a response from LTAT and Felda as to what's happening. Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim should know all this. As opposition leader, he was a critique of this. It is these issues that we need to address. Curb this corruption, which is, after all, what he's talking about. Deal with corruption in this country, because, as he put it, it's endemic. It's those issues we also have to clean up, along with the institutional reforms that are required in Felda and LTAT.
And to be fair, of course, the institutional reforms issue, etc., it perhaps first came up with regards to Felda when the white paper was then tabled in Parliament in 2019. back when it was under Azmin Ali's purview. So speaking of the fact that what came up during that white paper, they were actually contrasting the cash balance of 35 million ringgit May 9th, 2018, in contrast to 2.5 billion in just 2007. Yes. So some issues had already come up then, but yet they were not really addressed. But going back to what you were saying about the settlers' voices, this wasn't, of course, the first time that they were perhaps put forth as a hidden narrative. As far back as mid-2012, prior to even flotation of FGV holdings, there was, of course, the formation of Gabungan Wawasan Generasi Felda, the GWGF, and they had actually raised the issue about them not being certain or them being unsure and not wanting for it to be incorporated.
Yes. Let's start first with the white paper. I'm glad you raised it. Mm-hmm. That white paper was issued in 2019. This was under Mahathir's second administration with Pakatan. Why was no action taken when the white paper exposed how Felda was being abused? The white paper draws attention to many of the issues I just discussed about investments abroad, including in London, and about the use of BVI, the British Virgin Island Company, as a place to store this money. A lot of issues were raised with inflated prices. Since then, after Mahathir's government, we had Muhyiddin, and after that we had Ismail Sabri, and now we have Anwar Ibrahim. I haven't seen these problems being addressed by any of these prime ministers, even though we have seen a shift in terms of who is the prime minister. This now brings us back to the issue of political will and the lack of political will to bring about these reforms. Why is there this lack of political will? Let's now go on to your second point, the point when FGV was going to be listed. Mahathir wanted it to be listed. It was put on hold, actually, by Abdullah Badawi, because Abdullah Badawi, as Prime Minister, saw the resistance. Abdullah Badawi, in fact, made another major shift. He took control, personal control as Prime Minister of Felda. Before, Felda used to be under an other ministry, Cooperatives Ministry. It was taken and put under the Prime Minister's control because he knew he had to deal with Felda. But he also had to deal with Felda from another perspective. Felda has a huge parliamentary constituency base.
That's right, about 54 total voting constituencies spread across more than 1 million voting individuals.
In 2004, he took it over, and he knew that was a core base. He had to ensure that they stuck with UMNO, given the problems also in UMNO, and also the protest against the public listing of FGV. The second point was Abdullah also focused on agriculture. If you remember Abdullah's key policy framework, he focused a lot on agriculture. And Felda, again, looms large. He had the right intention. But the point here is this. The settlers were also very clear. They did not like the direction in which Felda was now being taken. And Abdullah backtracked. Then Najib comes in, and not long later, we see fundamental shifts, including the listing of FGV. They protested. A lot of the settlers set up a group called Anak, which were opposed to this because they are smart people. They're in the industry. They know what's happening. They were recognizing the implications of these structural changes, but it still got pushed through. This indicates a major structural problem. Too much power in the office of the executive to push through changes in these GLC-type institutions at will, even if there are protests on the ground from the settlers themselves, even though it involves their land. The executive has enormous power to go against their will and push through a deal, which now, because of this, they are now mired in debt. This rural middle class, this successful rural middle class, is now mired in debt. And they had an inkling that this might happen. And this has come to bear. And who is taking responsibility for all this?
That's right, because technically speaking, it was not them who incorporated or acquired or accrued any of these debts.
That's right. This is not of their doing, totally beyond their control. In fact, they didn't even know this was happening, beyond even their eyes. Now, what kind of system is this? That when we are dealing with people, their livelihood, their land, enormous asset base, enormous resources, then taking it out of their control and investing it in dubious deals, and that too abroad, beyond any public scrutiny.
So when we are looking at, of course, political will aside, so is that the remedy for this financial tipping point, which has been revealed by the AG's report?
Yes. In fact, only when we are confronted with a financial crisis, the politicians then are forced to act. And I have to say this, even then they don't act, as we saw in 2019 when the white paper was released and they showed us the problem. And that was 5 years ago.
Fair enough. Yes.
What change has occurred after 5 years? What reforms have been introduced during these 5 years to address these problems? The politicians are not willing to address these problems. And the people who are now facing the consequences of this are the settlers. We're talking about a total population of about 1.5 million people. And that is why you saw the protest votes in the last election too.
Fair enough.
And that's why UMNO is lost a lot of electoral support. This was their core base, their safe deposit, as they like to call it. They lost their safe deposit electorally because of the corruption that emerged from this whole mindset change from them functioning as a cooperative to a corporation, to a global institution with assets all over the world. And look at where it has taken them. So this thing about moving from being a cooperative to a conglomerate, we can see now the repercussions of moving in that direction if it's not properly done. In fact, I'm totally opposed to it. I don't think that's the direction in which they should have moved.
So clearly, so we've looked at the management control aspect of it, institutionally as well. Now, legislatively speaking, what more can be done moving forward now that we're sitting here firmly in 2024?
I'm glad you raised that. The legislation part is important because Felda is a statutory body. It's got its own law. But then when you create FGV, it doesn't fall under that act. It falls under the Companies Act. It's set up as a company. So it falls under the jurisdiction of the Companies Corporation, CCM. CCM now has jurisdiction over them. But my question is, the CCM really monitor? They have about 1.2 million companies functioning in Malaysia. How much attention is being paid to all these companies and what's happening in these companies? Now here you can see a shift. Now, here's the other thing. As a statutory body, they're supposed to table their accounts in Parliament annually. There is oversight of statutory bodies through Parliament. There's no such thing of companies. I mean, 1.2 million companies are not going to go table their, including FGV. They're not going to go and table their accounts in Parliament. So parliamentarians have no oversight of this. So who has oversight of these companies? That oversight is gone. Felda was under oversight of Parliament. Parliamentary could check them, what is happening there. That was not the case today. Let me say this. It is not only Felda. Let's take another institution, Felcra. Felcra is also similar to Felda. Felcra went through the same problem. From Felcra, they converted it into Felcra Berhad. Felcra Berhad then became a company. Felcra Berhad has been mired in serious corruption. UMNO politician was charged in court for it along with his wife. There's just one case involving Felcra. Again, we can see the settlers losing managerial control over their assets. Let's take the case of Mara. Mara functions in a different way. I'm bringing up Mara because Mara was mentioned in the Auditor-General's report. Do you know that Mara did things very similar to Felda? Mara created a holding company called Mara Incorporated. They invested in assets in buildings in Australia, which became a major scandal. Much of the money was channeled out and put in the British Virgin Islands. What's going on here? The trends that we are talking about in Felda were manifested also in Mara, were manifested in Felcra. And let me also say this, the Attorney General's report, the Auditor General's report only dealt with a small number of GLCs. So how much more is going on there in the shadow economy that we know nothing of? How much wastage is going on? How much more of this corporatization has occurred?
I love the fact that you bring up the shadow economy. So speaking about that, now how could Felda's governance in specific, the structure be rejigged perhaps to safeguard not just the principles of transparency, but also public accountability, starting perhaps first with an equitable share in the board of governors from the settlers themselves?
Yes. This question is important because we are now moving on to this discussion on reforms. the reforms are long overdue. The settlers are suffering. And they were not suffering before all this nonsense started. These grand ideas about corporatization, about conglomeratization, going global. We should look at the history of Felda, because it's an interesting history. A success story was created. A poor community was made a middle class. They owned land. They were part and parcel of the production process. The second generation was also getting involved in this production process through education.
They had autonomy and financial and economic
And they had know-how.
Mm-hmm.
They knew the land. They lived on the land. They knew how to develop the land. They learned by doing. Of course, there was a generation that left, and there were problems there that had to be addressed. But there was also a generation that grew on the Felda lands, knew how it operated, and with education could have contributed to the upliftment, taking it up to the next level, bringing technological development, making them see value in Felda and in the sectors that they were in. And they were educated, the second, third generation. There was no focus on these issues. Mm-hmm. These people lived on the land, they know how it functions, they know the way in which it operates. They now have education. With that education, they can take it to the next level. And they will be the owners of the land. And this is what we're talking about, Bumiputra empowerment, which the government has been talking about, Bumiputra economic empowerment. There was a model here that worked. And that's what should have been the focus, to let the next generation build on what was started, rather than taking it away from them and corporatizing them and taking it into a corporate world which they had no control over. So I would start there. Let's look at that history. Let's look at how it was structured. Let's look at how we can bring the second, third generation back in. Let's see how we can remodel this to the way it was before, incentivize the young to get involved. Second, institutionally, the FGV model, the FIC model is not working. We know it leads to corruption and abuse of power. Let's go back to empowering the Felda settlers themselves on decision-making control. This means major institutional revamps. It's not simple.
Could we be looking at, as what several economists have suggested, Prof., which is that Felda, among others, should venture into the agro-food sector, perhaps?
Those are spin-offs, which I agree can go. But I want to come back to Felda
Sure.
institutionally and FGV. The discussion is now privatize FGV. By that means delist it. That they may have to go that way, just like what LTAT did with Boston. They have to delist it, Boston plantations, delist it, then do the restructuring. Once you take it out of the stock exchange, okay, now it's privatized, it becomes easier to get these reforms going. Then we can look at the asset base and see how do we deal with these assets? How do we put these assets back in the hands of the cooperative, of the settlers themselves? Those are the kinds of revamps that we need to look at. These involves a lot of serious work. The government says that they've set up a committee to look at this. Mm-hmm. I'm waiting to see what the committee is going to recommend, because it can be done. In fact, it should be done.
And what kind of a timeline, in conclusion, as a parting thought, do you think such institutional restructuring could take, Prof?
I think we have to work quickly. Remember, we lost 5 years.
Yes, we did indeed.
2019 was all exposed. We are now 2024. This government has to act immediately to get this done. But is the government doing it? No. Who was recently appointed as the chairman of Felda? An UMNO politician. Mm-hmm. In fact, they're repeating the bad practices of the past today, when one would have thought they would be moving to correct these bad practices. First and foremost, politicians cannot sit as chairman of Felda.
Fair enough. So there you have it in a nutshell. Prof. Terence, absolute pleasure having you on the show. Wish we could continue the discussion, but we've come to the end of our time. So there you have it. That's all we have time for today. This has been Niaga Spotlight with me, Tamina Kaushji. We'll see you again next week with more business analysis and insights. Here's to a productive week ahead. Right. So we're just in the background. Yeah, it was actually...